Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Steve Allred, and I am the Director of Government Relations for the Church State Council. And the Church State Council is the sponsor of this webinar here today that we are calling Embracing Justice and Mercy, a Christian Perspective on Immigration and the Law. So, boy, this is a big topic, right? And I think a lot of people in America today are talking about immigration. The treatment of immigrants in America, both documented and undocumented, is a topic of conversation and also controversy. The news, of course, and social media are full of stories of immigrants and sometimes even citizens being detained and deported, some without any due process. Some are celebrating these developments, others are troubled by them. And these stories are more than abstract developments. They are touching people who actually some of our panelists today know. And I recognize that this is a controversial topic, as we just said, and we aren't here to take a partisan or a political side on the issue. We're here to look for biblical principles to guide us as some among us, people of faith in our church and around our country, are facing a crisis. We're here to live out the command that, according to Jesus, sums up all of Scripture. And it's found in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. And he said this, "So in everything, therefore, do to others what you would have them to do to you, for this is the law and the prophets." And so with that, let me introduce my friends who will be joining us today. And let me just pull up their profiles here. I am learning how to do this. First of all, we have Danny Kwan with us today. And Danny, I'm going to unmute you there. And then we have Daniel Rodella. And last but not least, we have Mark Valencia. I want to just welcome all of you and thank you for being a part of this webinar panel discussion today. And let's just take a minute and go around and introduce ourselves. I've introduced myself, and Mark, would you introduce yourself and we'll go around the circle.
Thank you very much for having me. I am an attorney in Hawaii. I've been practicing for 29 years now. I have the privilege of doing all of the legal work for the Hawaii Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. I'm also an officer in the Army Reserve, coming close to the end of my career there. And I've been a member of the Adventist Church since I was about 9 months old, I think.
It's good to have you here, Mark.
Thanks.
Daniel Rodella, tell us about yourself.
Hey, Steve. Thank you so much for having me. Daniel Rodella. I'm a community organizer out here in the Central Valley, also known as the breadbasket of the United States. I've also done higher education philanthropy for some time and been a parochial ministry leader for over 20 years. So I've been a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church for most of my life. So it's a privilege to be on this conversation.
And when you say PARL, some people may not know what that is, but that stands for Public Affairs and Religious Liberty. So
it's SDA jargon, Public Affairs and Religious Liberty.
And so you've been involved with that for a long time, and yes, so appreciate your work in that field. Danny Kwan, please tell our listeners a little bit about who you are.
Okay, I'm Danny Kwan. I'm been an attorney for over 25 years, starting in Canada, where I'm from. I currently live in California. I do legal work here, but I'm also the HR director for the Northern California Conference. I've been an Adventist my whole life, and I live here in Roseville, California.
And did you mention you're an immigration attorney as well, right?
Yes, I've been doing a lot of immigration attorney work.
Which is going to be relevant to our discussion today, and so I just wanted to bring that in. Yeah. Well, let's begin, and I want to ask you, Daniel Rodella, about kind of the big picture here. Why are we talking about this issue today? Because listen, we don't like to just pick up on things that are controversial and talk about them, but it seems like this issue is mattering to a lot of people. Tell us why.
Well, I think, there's several reasons. For the sake of time, I think it's important to highlight a few of them. I think there's a lot of folks that are concerned regarding the dimension of the economic sphere, the social and cultural impacts. There's also political dimensions, but I think most importantly for our listeners, for our viewers, the matter of faith, right? How do we balance our, civic duty or responsibility as members of the society, and then also with what God requires of us based on His kingdom? So definitely, there's those dimensions, and a lot of people have questions about how should I go about this polarizing topic, right? The Bible says one thing, political, pundits say another thing. I hear this. If you're a student, I hear, a certain narrative in the classroom. I hear and I see, what's happening in my communities. And so I think there are all those, implications that matter to folks. Immigration touches upon fundamental aspects of people's lives, of societies, economic prosperity, cultural identity, and then how do we balance that too with humanitarian principles? So definitely there's a lot to grapple with, and I think in a nutshell, Steve, those are probably the most basic ones that matter to folks.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Why should we be talking about this today?
Well, it's a pretty hot topic. There's a lot of immigrants in our country right now, and there are a lot of illegal immigrants, if you want to use that term. There are people that are doing things, waiting for their processing of their application, and things are at a point where I think a lot of people that in the past have been allowed to wait for their application to proceed or to be, to have to come to some sort of conclusion are now being picked up and put into detention. And so it's becoming a bigger topic that's affecting literally millions of people that live in America and have been living here for decades, so in some cases. And so I think that's why it's becoming a hot topic.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think if we look back in history, this country, the United States, is a country of immigrants, right? I mean, unless you're a Native American, you're an immigrant. Your ancestors were immigrants to this land, right? And we sometimes forget that if we've lived here for a generation or two. But and so we see, immigration today is again, it has been a topic throughout America's history that we have dealt with, right, at different times. We know from history, different groups have been, made illegal at different times throughout our history. And so let's talk about kind of what is happening on the ground today, and what, I think that kind of brings us to why we're here today, because I've been hearing some feedback from some of our church members here in the Pacific Union that they're afraid, that their families are afraid, the people they know are scared, and they're wondering, where are my brothers and sisters in Christ during this time? Because it's not just those who are illegal, who are experiencing, if you want to use that term, undocumented, whatever, that are having problems right now. Sometimes folks are getting rounded up who have status, or even who are citizens, and they're feeling targeted, right? I mean, so tell me what you guys see happening on the ground. I want to hear some stories, maybe of real people. And Danny, Kwan, you were just talking, but maybe tell us some of the stories of some of your clients. I think that might kind of help set us up for a conversation about how we as Christians should respond to these situations.
Well, I got involved with immigration work. To be honest, I've always tried to stay away from immigration work because it can be, it's not very well paying, and it's also very stressful, and you're dealing with people's lives. And at the beginning of my career, 25 years ago, I did some immigration work in Canada, and then I really didn't do immigration work again. However, working in ministries throughout my career, I got really good at doing R1 visas, work visas for religious workers, and all of the, that sort of thing. But last year, getting involved with Sac Central Church in Sacramento, they've been doing refugee ministry, and they have a lot of Afghans that they're helping, that they're working with. And it's like a Muslim outreach at the same time. And just in helping them, they were begging. I mean, these Afghanis have like very limited resources. They've come here with nothing, and they have nothing. And as a lot of people know, Afghanistan as a country is very poor. And so they don't have relatives that can send them money. And so on pro bono, I picked up a few clients. I said, I don't know what I'm doing, but I will help you when you go in front of the immigration judge, because they can't do their last in-person hearing if they don't have an attorney. And so I agreed to do that. And so I started taking webinars. I joined, different groups to try to learn more about asylum immigration law. And I've learned a few things. But what I've noticed is that, I mean, these are people that helped American soldiers. And I learned a lot about their journey. And it was very interesting. So in 2021, when the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan, a lot of the Afghanis that helped U.S. soldiers didn't rush to the airport. A lot of poor people did, but a lot of the people that worked for U.S. soldiers, worked for the military, said they were told, just wait. We will call you. We will pick you up. We will take you out. So they waited, and nobody came to get them. So now these people had to leave Afghanistan because they were fearing for their lives. The Taliban poured into Kabul. So they all escaped to Pakistan. And now they're in Pakistan, and they're given what's called special immigrant status, special visas, but nothing was getting processed. And in the remaining time of Biden's office, he processed things very slowly, to the point where it was just a trickle of people getting processing. They continued to get letters of support so that Pakistan wouldn't deport them, saying, we will process these people eventually, please allow them to stay. Some people did not trust that they will ever get status with this trickle of people being seen at the embassies. So they made this long, arduous journey. A lot of them came to Brazil first, because Brazil was offering special visas. And then from Brazil, they made the journey all the way to the US border and came into America thinking, we help the Americans. We have letters from, for example, we have letters from generals and colonels and other soldiers. And we know that if we just get to America, they'll help us. And they came into the country, and they were immediately treated under what's called removal proceedings. And so they were basically told, you're going to be removed, but you need to prove that you're an asylee. And so a lot of them were detained for months. And so then now they're working on their asylum application. So what's happened though, and these people have compelling stories. They have letters of support. They're going to get asylum. There's no question. And so in some ways I felt like, I don't mind doing this. I'm helping a subset of people that truly deserve to be here, right? And our government has taken their time, but they've managed to get here. They're relatively safe, and they're going to get help. And there's a lot of red tape, and there's been setbacks and things like that, but that's the system. So I chalked it up to that. But since January, things have changed. These people are being treated literally like for example, a few of my clients, they got an email saying, you must leave the country within 2 weeks. You no longer have protected status. And if you don't leave after 2 weeks, you will be fined $500 per day. And these people started freaking out. Where am I going to go? I mean, they can't go back to Afghanistan. Where are they going to go? And so I told them, just sit tight. There's nothing you can do about this. It's just probably just a mass email that they sent to everybody. But since then, for example, on June 2nd, Trump did an executive order or proclamation, basically saying that no Afghanis will get visas. And no Afghanis are allowed in the country. He's removed their protective status. People are going to start getting deported. One man who was a translator, he was embedded with U.S. forces. He saved countless of lives. I've seen letters. Right now, he went to ICE for his regular check-in, and they almost detained him. We managed to keep him from getting detained, but they put an ankle bracelet on him and limited him to 25 miles within his house. He works doing delivery, truck delivery, commercial delivery. I mean, he goes all the way to the Bay Area. It's affected his ability to provide for his family now, and he doesn't know what to do. And ICE won't remove his ankle bracelet. So I've seen a shift where even the people that deserve to be here, who are going through the process, who have the paperwork, they're working within the humanitarian asylum system that we have created here in America for people exactly like these people. They have nowhere to go. The UN has recognized that Afghanistan is a nation where they cannot return. And these people were our allies. They helped Americans. And we are now turning our backs on them. And we're literally kicking them out of the country and treating them like they don't belong here. They're scared. And in the face of that, as a Christian, seeing this, I'm just like, what am I supposed to do? Like, what am I supposed to feel? And it's difficult to support what's happening legally when these people are being treated this way. And these are people that helped us. So you can imagine the people, and I can go on with other cases that I have that are non-Afghani, of how they're being treated. So it's almost like we've made this decision in this country, certain leaders, that we do not want anyone that wants to try to come into this country unless we want them here, But if you've come here because you want to live in America for whatever reason, because you're fleeing persecution or you're looking for economic benefits, even if you're trying to do it the right way, it's almost like a subset of leadership has said, no, we're going to find a way to frustrate your efforts and make sure that doesn't happen in the end, even to allies like our Afghanistan people.
And so I think some may push back on that and say, all right, well, you can just stay where you are. There's no right to immigrate anywhere. And good luck, I mean, you should basically be able to just find a life somewhere else. And I think you're saying, Danny, that especially with these cases of like these Afghans who have helped the U.S., if anybody deserves to come here, it ought to be them. What happens to these people if they go back to Afghanistan? What would happen to someone who helped out the U.S. military? They go back. Afghanistan's controlled by the Taliban now. What's the likely outcome for someone like them?
Well, since June 2nd, since the executive order was made, Pakistan has made the decision to start deporting the Afghanis. They didn't want them there to begin with. And so I'm hearing secondhand, but I'm hearing from my clients stories. So these people that decided, we're not going to sneak into America. We're going to do it the right way. We're going to wait. The State Department will surely give us a visa. We will wait, even if it takes us 10 years. We will wait. And even under the threat of deportation from Pakistan, they waited. But since Trump made this proclamation on June 2nd, the Pakistan government said, well, if you're not going to give them visas, then they definitely don't belong here. And they've started mass deportation. And I'm hearing stories of torture and death of a lot of these people.
Back in Afghanistan.
Yes.
So as Christians, that troubles me. And that's just one little story. I read a story in Christianity Today about some Iranian Christians who were also being detained and potentially deported back to Iran, of all places, where, of course, with the latest situation between Israel and Iran and the United States intervening there, would not make them welcome there, I'm thinking, along with the fact that they're Christian and Iran is a majority Muslim country. It just seems like, politics aside, do we as Christians care about these things, or should we care about these types of things? What do you guys think? And don't talk all at once here. So I want to hear from you guys, because I feel like, and listen, maybe someone can say, well, come on, you guys need to toughen up a little bit. This is just how the world works. But I guess I'm looking at this from, we've already looked at it kind of from a political standpoint. Danny, you're saying, hey, these people helped us out. They ought to be able to, come here and get asylum. But just on a humanitarian and spiritual level, Jesus calls us to stand up for the oppressed, right? To help those who are suffering. And if someone's being persecuted for their faith, like these Iranian Christians potentially, or these Afghans who have helped us out, it seems like we ought to care about that and say, what can we do? What can we do to help in these situations? I don't know. I want to hear from you guys. I don't want to just be, tell me if I'm wrong.
I don't view this issue much differently than any other legal issue. And representing the church in Hawaii, we have issues that come up all the time that are legal issues that affect members. And we always look at the legal side of it, the spiritual side of it, the compassionate side of it. But we always start with, okay, is there a law that's been broken here? So sometimes a recurring issue is, unfortunately, people involved in alleged sex assault issues. And then the question is, do you allow them to come to church? Do they present a danger to other members? And so we go through this whole analysis. But in every one of those issues, we start with the law. Okay, has the law been broken? All right. And so we start there. And then we start talking about, okay, is this person a danger to anyone who's a member there? And we're always looking at, well, we don't want to, if we can help it, deprive someone of the spiritual needs that they have of coming to church, of fellowshipping. But it's always a totality of the circumstances analysis that we use. And I think what we're doing with this immigration issue is we're kind of, in some respects, skipping over the first part of the analysis, is the legal part of this, right? And I just want to say a few words about that. There is, I've heard a number of politicians say that basically there is no federal immigration law that if you come to the country illegally, that it's a civil matter, and that's inaccurate. We have a federal law, 8 USC 1325, that does provide for criminal penalties if you come into the country illegally. So that issue is it's a criminal legal issue. You mentioned, Steve, that we are a country of immigrants, and I hear people say that a lot. I think we are a country full of immigrants, which is a wonderful thing, but I think we're a country of citizens. And when you become a citizen, that's when you get all of the benefits that the greatest country on earth has to offer. And people who come here from all around the world are coming to take advantage of citizenship here. So we can't ignore that issue. I do kind of, as an aside, want to thank you for using the word immigrant instead of migrant. I know this is just a personal pet peeve of mine, but all sides of this debate have started using the word migrant instead of immigrant. And it really is nails on the chalkboard for me, because a migrant is someone who goes to another country to go to school or work temporarily and goes back to their home country. And an immigrant is someone who makes a permanent move. So not necessarily relevant to anything we're talking about, but I just had to get that off my chest here. And thank you for using the word immigrant instead of migrant. But I do think that we have to not ignore the legal side or the compassionate side. And we have, I'd just like to share a story we have here in Hawaii. There's a man who is from South Korea who came here, and I guess he must have gotten some kind of legal status here. He must have, because he served in the Army and actually served in combat, got a Purple Heart for being injured, got out of the Army, got into some trouble after he got out, was convicted of a crime and subject to a removal order, but didn't go. And then, like a lot of other people, he just stayed. And this was 10 plus years that he was subject to a removal order. And now that things are changing under the current administration, they are enforcing that removal order. So he self-deported himself to South Korea. So it's big news here in Hawaii. And, I think even with someone like that, who was subject to a deportation order, there ought to be someone looking at the specific facts of his case and taking a step back and saying, wait, what are we doing here? Is this really necessary? And he's not in the same league as the Afghanis that Danny was just talking about, because he's not subject to torture and murder, I think, when he goes back to South Korea. But the fact that he served our country and was injured in combat should have someone who's in the pipeline here who's enforcing these things. Say, wait, is this really something that we need to do with this guy? Is there some other way that we can handle this without using such extreme measures? So I am of the mind that we have to look at all sides of it: the legal side, the compassionate side, the spiritual side of this as well.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like there's something that we haven't really maybe gotten into that much here. It feels like that's driving some of this. And it seems like there's kind of this narrative that immigrants are the source of a lot of our problems here. And Daniel Rodella, you did touch on that at the beginning, I think, a little bit, but there's like this overlying narrative that these people are to blame for our economic problems, our crime, et cetera, et cetera. I had a friend who I invited to be here today, wasn't able to make it, who I was talking to about the crime aspect, and he's a prosecutor, and he said, and I forget the exact number, he said less than 1%, I think he said, maybe 2% of the crimes that he prosecutes here in California are committed by, illegal immigrants. It's just not a reality that these people are the source of the majority of our crimes. In fact, I've read some statistics that immigrants in general are really just not, very low compared to citizens, So I feel like there's kind of this scapegoating going on. That's my perspective with people. And so we're willing to deport a Purple Heart recipient like the guy you're talking about, Mark, in Hawaii. I read about him, who, got convicted of some drug charges 15 years ago. And yet he's been a good citizen otherwise. He's not a danger to society. And yet just because we're trying to get rid of anyone we can, we're going to get rid of him. I feel like that's a problem when we're just like, let's just get rid of everybody because somehow it'll solve our problems. And I'm just wondering how do we, I guess, maybe Daniel Rodella, where do we go from here? How do we help kind of correct the narrative? Because my experience has been that, the folks who come here looking for a better life, they do so for good reason. A lot of them are trying to flee violence in, Central America, maybe gang violence. They're coming up here. They want a better life for their family. They come here, they work hard. They pay taxes, even if they're undocumented, And I'm not saying it's good to be undocumented. I'm not trying to promote that. But a lot of the people I know, I have personal friends who are undocumented. Some of them through no fault of their own. Their parents brought them here as 10-year-olds or 12-year-olds, and here they are. They're stuck. What do? They have no place to go. So, Daniel, what do we do to kind of, I don't really have an agenda here, but I do have an agenda to try to help us go in the right direction. And I feel like if we're blaming immigrants for our problems when that's not necessarily the cause of them, that's a problem to me. I don't know.
No, I think it's important, to first and foremost, maybe even describe, how big is the population we're talking about of undocumented immigrants, right? I think the Migration Policy Institute back in 2023 was saying there's not random numbers, but there's, between 11 and 13 million. I think the last estimate that I read was 13.7 million undocumented immigrants, right? You touched on the aspect of the economy. You talked on the aspect briefly of safety, and just, putting on my community organizer cap. One of the questions when I'm meeting with folks in the community, when we're having listening sessions, when we're trying to identify what are the issues that the community is seeing, what are potential solutions that the community can find to those issues, and what are the steps, right, to be able to actualize those solutions, is that whoever controls the narrative controls the outcome. That's a very important thing to always remember. Whoever controls the narrative controls the outcome. And one of the questions we always ask folks is, who stands to benefit from this issue, right? And so those are questions that when we're talking about immigration and we're talking about undocumented immigrants, we're talking about 13 million folks, right? And we're listening to these narratives about taking jobs. We're listening to these narratives about, illegal voting. And we're listening to these narratives about safety, rapists, criminals, the worst of the worst, right? I think it's important for us to maybe even touch really, really quickly on the aspect of the jobs, right? That has economic implications. There's a Pew Research survey back in 2024 that highlighted a couple of interesting facts. 75% of Americans, Steve, said that undocumented immigrants fill undesirable jobs. 75%. 61% of Americans said the same thing about documented immigrants. When we're talking about who stands to benefit, I think there's a lot to be said just in this survey outcome. When we're looking at what are the type of jobs that folks are taking from this community, they're physically demanding jobs. They're low-paying jobs. They're jobs that lack career advancement opportunities. And I'll give you a couple. Agriculture, right? There's 3 million farm workers nationwide. 3 million. You know how many are undocumented? Take a guess, Steve. 50%.
Okay.
50%. And if you individualize it per state, for example, California, over 75% undocumented. Okay. That's just in the agricultural workforce. When you're looking at the construction workforce, there's 12 million construction workers nationwide, 25% undocumented. So these are jobs that undocumented immigrants are filling that have economic impacts, such as the food that you have on your table, your apples, your lettuce, the nuts, you name it. You're able to pay less at the store because of these folks, right? When you're looking at how immigrants benefit the American economy, it was the American Immigration Council this year who once again confirmed the same thing. Undocumented immigrants fill undesirable labor gaps. They allow Americans to be able to specialize in quality jobs that pay well. And undocumented folks are not just folks, who are just laborers. They're also consumers, and they're also entrepreneurs who boost the overall economy. How? Through taxes, through spending, right? They contribute to the lowering cost of goods and services. So I think you hear the narrative on the one side talking about, they're draining the economy, they're taking jobs. But then on the other side, you see, qualitative studies, and you see quantitative studies as well that paint a different picture. And the question that I would ask the community is, who stands to benefit from this narrative? Who gets to control? Who gets to build political platforms? Who gets to, right, fill in the blank? So I think it's very important to be able to highlight these facts, because it really helps to understand things a little bit more in the bigger picture that you were talking about, Steve. But I think there's definitely a lot to be said in this, in terms of like the economic impacts. I mean, back in 2022, there was a study that shared that, documented immigrants paid $100 billion in terms of federal, state, and local taxes. Yet they're not able to participate in Social Security, Medicare, right? They also contribute to unemployment taxes, excise, property, business, personal taxes, right? And yet they're barred from social insurance programs and tax credits that benefit Americans. So I think it's very important to consider that, especially right now that there's been this move from where we're at, let's say, for instance, 2016, 2017, and now to more punitive, more harsh immigration enforcement that is making folks feel very scared, making folks feel not just scared about losing their jobs, but also about being separated from their families, right? And I think we can get into this whole discussion of whether, well, they shouldn't have come here in the first place, like you were talking about. But the reality at this is that this nation, that the economic system we're in, right, and the way that it's working is highly dependent on the undocumented, cheapened labor force. And that's a reality. There's a lot of studies on that. So I think we can talk about the letter of the law, but we also have to balance that out with the spirit of the law. I don't think that folks come to this country just because they want citizenship. I think a lot of folks would have stayed in their country if there wouldn't have been American intervention in their countries. But I think Danny was talking about, a clear example. So I think that there are a lot of things to discuss and to consider in that. But I think when it comes to taking jobs, the studies flat out show they don't take American
They're taking jobs nobody else wants.
They take on American jobs.
and a lot of them are, I might add, are not working illegally, because Mark, to kind of address what you were saying, a lot of the people that come into this country, they are, what you might say, they came illegally, criminally even, right? But there is a system that has been set up that allows for people to then get, to file an application, to be heard, maybe because they're fleeing persecution or something in their country, but also in the interim to work. And so then they're giving work authorization so that they can provide for their families and they cannot be a burden on society. And so then when they have that opportunity, a lot of these people take jobs that are lower paying, that are, like what you were talking about, Daniel. But what's happening right now is these people that have work authorizations, who have an application in process, because their initial entry was illegal, right? That they shouldn't have come in that way, or so to speak. They are now being apprehended and put into detention, to the point where our detention facilities are full and overflowing. And the big, beautiful bill has billions of dollars, I think hundreds of billions of dollars in there to build new facilities to house illegal immigrants. And it costs us right now $134 a day to house an illegal immigrant. And a lot of these detention facilities are privately run facilities. There's a company called Geo, for example, that runs a lot of them. And I've been hearing from my clients that are detained, the food is inedible. I mean, it is just, it's breakfast is a banana and like a granola bar. That's it. I mean, you'll lose weight, you'll starve if that's all you eat. So they have a canteen where if you have cash, then you will then be able to buy, ramen noodles and chocolate bars and a lot of processed food, but then you won't starve. And so then if you don't have anyone able to send you money, you will literally starve. So we would rather spend $134 a day detaining these people in these expensive facilities that we're building more and more, or we could let them continue to work on their legal work authorizations that we've given them while they wait for their processing of their application. And to me, I'm seeing a shift in that, and that is quite alarming. And like Daniel's saying, there's a whole lot of jobs that no Americans are going to do, and it's going to start affecting our economy. So,
any other comments?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Mark.
Well, I wanted to just mention that on a personal note, my view, we talked about this offline, but my view on this whole subject is colored by my origin story. My parents are immigrants from Honduras, came here as uneducated immigrants legally. My dad came over first, went through an educational program, got a license and training to learn how to fix TVs and radios. That was his profession. He then brought my mother, and my brother and sisters over, and then I was born here. So I'm the first American citizen in my family, and so that does have a big impact on how I view legal versus illegal immigration. And Daniel raised a good point about who stands to benefit from all of this, and I think that's an important question, because it's the reason, I think, why we've had a massive failure by both political parties for decades to deal with this issue, because people have been benefiting from it. They've benefited from cheap labor, et cetera. And the scale that we're dealing with, nobody really knows. We don't have people standing up, raising their hands saying, yes, I'm here illegally, count me, so we can figure out exactly how many we have. I mean, I've heard estimates upwards of 20 million. And I want to share a personal story too of my Army Reserve duty, where I was assigned to Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, population 20,000 for 3 years. I flew there once a month for 3 years. I went to an Adventist church there that was right across the street from my unit. And it was the coolest thing because there was just, when I went there this one Sabbath, the first Sabbath I went there, the only people in attendance were the pastor and his family. It was a pastor, his wife, young kids, and 2 adult college students. And they were having a full-on church service. And the pastor could not speak English. I don't know what his immigration status was, but I also would go to Walmart, to do my food shopping, and I saw numerous times groups of immigrants there who I don't believe could speak English, and it struck me because I said, if you have a population like that in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, I mean, the magnitude of where other immigrants are across the country just has to be enormous, and so they're benefiting from cheap labor. Now you have politicians, I think, trying to create a voting bloc. They want people to be counted in the census, so it affects the number of representatives you have in the House. So I'm very cynical about all of these folks, okay? Because they've all contributed. When I talk about folks that are political leaders, they've all contributed to this problem and allowed it to get to the point to where it is now. And I'm not even sure what we're going to do. I mean, part of me thinks that just from a legal standpoint, this is sort of like the abortion issue. I don't think there's ever going to be a political solution because we have so many people here now who have come here illegally, and you have these very complex situations, right? Where you have children, like Steve mentioned, the person who was brought here when they were 10 years old. I mean, what do you do with someone like that, right? What do you do with families who are going to be separated? What do you do with the South Korean soldier that I mentioned? These are very complicated situations now. I don't want to sound like a cynic here, but I'm just not sure how we're going to handle all of these issues here.
Yeah. Well, and isn't it? I mean, it's good that we don't have to solve that, I guess, right? Because I agree with you, Mark. I don't know what the solution is either. I guess what I want to ask all of you is, how do we, as the church, how do we face this issue, and how do we support our fellow human beings, right? And when I say support, I don't think that means we. I'm not talking about picking a political side here. I'm not talking about endorsing people coming here illegally, because it's interesting to hear you guys talk. As I'm listening, I'm thinking, man, I don't think anyone should want people here illegally. It's not good for them because they're going to be exploited, right? They're here, they're like trying to stay under the radar, and of course, people can exploit them because of the fact that they know that they've got this vulnerability, right? And yet at the same time, you're right. It benefits certain people if people are here illegally. So it's a very, very unfortunate situation. So, but how do we as the church move forward? The North American Division of Seventh-day Adventists issued a statement a couple months ago about this whole issue. I thought it was very well done. You can find it online. The Northern California Conference just yesterday, I think it was the day before, sent out a statement that they just talked about, affirming our shared humanity, essentially. I feel like that's something we need to remember in times like this. Whatever the government does, I think we have to be Christians first before we're Americans. Would you agree? I mean, we are citizens of heaven before we're citizens of any country on earth. So that's my reference point. That's our reference point. We say, okay, so what would Jesus have me do first? And I think it's the answer I find, tell me if I'm wrong, is love people, even the bad guys, even the people you might think are doing something wrong. Jesus tells us, well, let me hear from you. I'm talking too much, but what is the way forward as the church in a situation where we've got this very complicated situation? I think there are wrong things being done to good people. There are bad people, sure, that have come here illegally. I mean, there's all of this can be true. How do we as the church deal with it? Let me hear from you guys.
Yeah, well, I just want to maybe even frame it a little bit more too, along the lines of something that's very practical and without going too much into detail. But I think we would be pretty naive to think that folks who are undocumented are not in our ranks, right?
Oh,
and so when we're talking about church growth, when we're talking about growth in tithe, growth in offering, growth in soul winning, I think it was Ron Clusay back in 2006, around that time, who was in charge of evangelism for the NAD. He clearly said it. The church is growing in North America because he said the Hispanic group, right? That's how he said it. And it takes me back to what Ellen White said, way back when, right? She spoke about, and I'm going to go a little spiritual, right? She spoke about the Spanish work being at the vanguard of the work in North America, right? And so I'm not trying to say that every Spanish folk is undocumented, but I think when we're looking at migration pattern, when we're looking at patterns, I'll refrain from saying migration, immigration data. I think that there's a lot to be said along that, along those lines. So I just want to bring it back home and also speak about it not just as something that is out there somewhere in some vacuum.
Absolutely.
But that it's something also close to home.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And before maybe we start answering that, I do want to share a quick story, in terms of how this impacts people of faith, especially, folks that we identify with as Adventists, right? Early this year, when there was regular invisible enforcement of immigration starting, there were folks that were profiled, that were pulled over, people of faith with no criminal records, who were pulled over simply because, according to the federal officers, and I say federal because they were DEA and they were also HSI agents who were federalized to enforce immigration law here in Kern County, pulled over some folks who happened to go to the same church, who had positions in their church, and who were profiled simply for being, Latino. And, when I got to think about the impact, if those people would have been arrested and taken and deported, the impacts on their congregation, the impacts on their community, the impacts on their family, right? So once again, I think when we're talking about finding solutions, I think we also have to be, or not solutions, but maybe like talking about duties that we should be concerned about as Christians. I think we should also remember that they are our brothers, they are our sisters, and we have to handle this situation with care and not necessarily as something that is just happening out there, if that makes sense.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So you mentioned the love part of this, and I totally agree with that. I would add that I think there should be love and accountability as well. Loving someone doesn't mean that we condone choices that they've made. I think we treat them meaning people who are not here lawfully, like we would anyone else in terms of basic needs. We open our doors to everyone. Hopefully, we don't have a litmus test at the door if someone wants to come and worship. If someone wants to take advantage of the charitable things that we do, food banks and whatnot, I think we certainly make those resources available to everyone. So I was just thinking too, so what about assisting people with obtaining legal status. I mean, I kind of thinking out loud, but I'm not sure that's something the church should do necessarily, because it gets us involved in political issues, and it's a really fine line. Yeah, but I mean, just for me, on the human side, I have no problem with doing it. From an organizational standpoint, I think it's a lot more complicated.
I agree. I think to add on that too, you hit it right on point. I mean, as an organizer, when we're talking about bringing in change, we're also looking at the political side of things, right? And I think that as Adventists, who historically, if we go back to the 1800s, were involved in the abolitionist movement, were speaking truth to power. I think as a church, a lot of times we dance around these issues too. And I think we also need to consider what are appropriate ways within the way that our church operates to be able to be involved in finding solutions like that. Because you'd be surprised how many times, folks have wanted to, get involved in trying to find solutions like that. And it's always like, well, it's a political issue, and so like we shouldn't get involved. So I think that there is also room for some work to be done there as well.
What happens when it becomes a humanitarian issue? So, Mark, you mentioned, basic caring for people's basic needs, and hospitality and this kind of thing. What happens though when we see families being, separated, parents and children, young children sometimes? And this is, stuff that we see happening with some of this enforcement. What happens when people are being sent without due process to the prison in El Salvador? What happens when people are being sent back to their home countries where, they've come here and they've been accepted here and received asylum, but now it's been revoked and they're going back to a place where they could experience persecution and death? So as a Christian, not a political matter, but as a Christian, how do we respond to those kind of situations? Because I feel like, there's accountability, sure, but then there's also, well, what about, my 10-year-old, my friend who's now in his 30s, who came here when he was 10, a good friend of mine, stayed in my home before. How does accountability apply to him, right? And these are the complex situations I think, Mark, you were talking about earlier, right? And so I feel like as Christians, I'm not trying to be saying that the church ought to be solving all of this per se, but we have to, I feel like there's some sort of prophetic role for us here to go beyond, the options that the politics of the world give us, right? The politics say you got to be in this box or this box, and the church says, no, we're going to follow Jesus, and wherever he leads is where we're going to go. But what do you guys think about that?
Well, Ellen White, she wrote in Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, and I quote, "When the laws of men conflict with the word and law of God, we are to obey the latter, whatever the consequences may be." And just to cut to the chase, she says she was talking about the fugitive slave law was to be disregarded. And, you could make a case. In fact, critics of the Bible say the Bible condones slavery. So you could say that slavery, was not explicitly denounced by the Bible, and yet she said the slave laws should be disregarded. And Joseph Bates was involved in the underground movement. A lot of Adventists in Michigan were involved in the underground movement, and so our prophet tells us to explicitly disobey laws in our country if they go against the word of God. And so maybe I'm being overly simplistic, but when you see people be like, especially these people like from Afghanistan who are being sent back to certain death, I think that's just as bad as slavery. I would harbor somebody like that against the U.S. government. And I think as Christians, it's almost like that choice. I mean, the slaves were running away and they were breaking laws, U.S. laws, right? The slaves from the South, they were, you could say it was immoral, they were property, but the Bible tells slaves to obey your masters, so there was a deeper principle that Ellen White was talking about. It wasn't just this black and white following the Bible. And I think it goes back to what you originally said, Steve, about loving your fellow man. And in that context, what we're seeing happening right now, if we open our eyes and if we care to listen to the stories, is something that's beyond just following the law. There is a widespread program to just put people in detention and make life so miserable that they'll self-deport. And people are being put in detention that are doing things the right way. They have applications pending. They have family members. They have approved things. They're just waiting for their processing to complete. I'm not even talking about the people that came illegally. Nobody knows about them, and they're hiding out working on farms. I'm talking about people that, that have applications in process. And there's always a way. Even this U.S. soldier, I don't know is it an entire story, but there's an application called 42B, which is the removal of where he could have potentially stayed, but he self-deported. If somebody's here for over 10 years, even if they have a criminal record, so the U.S. government over the years have provided all kinds of avenues. It doesn't mean that they'll get it. It's still up to the discretion of an immigration judge. But can we give them a chance to get in front of a judge? Can we give them a chance to have their application heard? I think as Christians, we have a duty to support that.
I mean, I think the problem with the law is that it changes at the whims of whoever's making that law, right? I mean, we see that with the immigration laws throughout, the last however many 40, 100 years, I mean, my wife and her family, she's Chinese, born here in America. She wouldn't have been able to come here, back in the day, right? We've outlawed various groups throughout our history, and so I think we have to. I think again, looking at this from a Christian standpoint, what do we do now? I guess is kind of the question. Daniel Rodella, when you were talking a few minutes ago about, Ellen White talking about the Hispanic work being kind of at the forefront, it made me think of a quote. Maybe you're thinking of the same one, where she said, God is bringing people from all over the world to this country. We should look at this as a missionary opportunity. And I guess what I'd like to challenge our viewers today, to do is to take off our political hats for a moment. I don't care if you're, a bleeding heart liberal or a, hardcore Republican or whatever. Take off our hats for a second and say, okay, forget about all that. Forget about even being an American for a minute. And first of all, think of yourself as a child of God, part of the human family, and part of the great family of God throughout the world. How do we look at the person next door to us, the person right around us who, whether they're documented or undocumented, a citizen or an immigrant, they're a fellow human being? That should be our first thing. I think we all agree on that, right? And then the next thing is, what's an opportunity to lead them to Jesus so they can be a part of the kingdom of heaven, because that's where our citizenship first and foremost is. I guess I wish we as the church could just kind of say, that's our primary focus here. We want to lead people to Jesus, and then we got to care for them. We got to care about if they're being mistreated. I think that's kind of what we're talking about here today, right? Boy, so many things we could talk about.
Steve,
yes.
I wanted to maybe take a shot at your question, because it made me think about Matthew 25. And I know that quote or those verses from Matthew 25 are used a lot, right? But I think it's very important for us to consider that we are to be in solidarity with people. We are to walk with people. We are to cry with people, right? Mm-hmm. We are to be there with them. I think it was Ellen White who once said, and I'll paraphrase, you don't need to go to Israel or to Jerusalem and walk the streets to walk in the steps of Christ. You can go to the hood. You can go to the hospital. You can go where people are dying, and there you will be walking in the steps of Christ. And so in the spirit of what you were saying, I'm thinking, okay, yes, I think Mark was right. We need love isn't just protect, it's also correct. And I think those of us who are parents understand that pretty well. But at the same time, I think that we need to hold that standard to our government. And I think right now, with all the Christian nationalism going on, there tends to be some confusion in terms of how should we behave also when our government is not doing the right thing. I was in a city council meeting last year, and I heard a city council member speaking about the topic of immigration say that only citizens are protected under the Constitution, right? And so, wow, I was like, I can't believe that someone in public office and somebody with a master's degree or a graduate degree is saying things that are not accurate. And so, as a person of faith, there had to be a response. There had to be a challenging or a correcting of something that is not true. And the audacity to share that comment and try to justify it with the Bible, And so I think that we need to be in spaces in the spirit of Matthew 25 where the people, suffer and the people are in situations that are difficult. And yes, we also need to be prophetic and not pathetic when we're, interacting with the government.
Ooh.
We need to hold the government. We need to hold our leaders accountable, inside and outside of church. And I think that is where, as Christians, we really need to start thinking about who our allegiance is to. Is it to an ideology, or is it to a way of life that Christ has called us to be in? And I think it's difficult sometimes to be able to take our hats off, Steve, but I think it's important and it's critical for us to acknowledge our biases, but be open-hearted and willing to learn. And I once again, I love the fact that this is happening right here, right now, because I think this shows what good dialogue can be like and how we can learn from one another. How can we expand our minds and our hearts? And, that doesn't mean that we're always convinced about everything that everybody else says, but I think having critical dialogue is key. Unfortunately, many times we just go to a heuristical approach and take intellectual shortcuts. So I think this is definitely something that is needed and important. And I think that this is one way that we as Christians can also do our part, aside from what I already said, but just being engaged and having these discussions, not spiritualizing everything. Yes, the Lord is coming. Yes, his kingdom is different, but we're here right now. Sure. And we're living in this reality, and we have to wrestle with these issues while maintaining, our Christian soul, and what the Lord has called us to be.
I'm gonna steal your prophetic, not pathetic sometime. Mark, I think you had something you were going to say.
Well, I wanted to comment on a number of things that I've heard. I think that there is definitely a place for civil disobedience that Danny was mentioning, quoting Ellen White, and these issues regarding American slavery. I mean, slavery was a black and white issue, so to speak. I mean, it was American slavery was evil, no question about that. So her comments about ignoring laws related to American slavery, pretty simple. Immigration is more gray, because the basic law requiring people to come to the U.S. using a certain process on its face is not evil. It's not immoral, right? To say, hey, if you want to come here, you got to follow certain rules. So that's not illegal or immoral. And we do have situations where some people who are not here lawfully have committed crimes. I mean, some heinous crimes. Sure. And I don't think it matters, well, to me anyway, what the statistics show regarding whether they're committing more crimes or less crimes than American citizens. I mean, the fact is, those crimes are happening. So what do we say to the victims of those crimes and those family members? That's a more complicated question, right? And Steve, you had mentioned in passing the issue of separating families. I know that's come up a lot. And what do we do? Well, my my rhetorical question would be, what do we do with family members who are separated when they're American citizens, and that citizen commits a crime and has to go to prison? I mean, they're separated from their children when that happens. So what do we do in that situation? And it comes back to me to an individual versus organizational issue. And so on an individual basis, I think you speak up. I think you advocate. I think you do what Daniel mentioned about going to city council meetings, and if people are misstating the law, educating them, for sure. So on an individual basis, I think people need to rely on their conscience and how the Holy Spirit is leading them. On an organizational level, I would say we should be more neutral, because this is not the same as something like slavery. So I that's the way I would kind of approach it, is on an individual versus organizational basis.
Yeah. And I think the church, and just for the record, this panel here, we're not speaking for the Adventist Church, right? We are doing this on a platform that is sponsored by the Pacific Union Conference, but we're not setting policy or making official statements on behalf of the church. The church has put out some statements. I think they've been really balanced. I feel like they have tried to kind of take that prophetic ground and yet also not delve into the political weeds too much. So no, I appreciate what you're saying. All right, we're going to try to wrap this up here in a few minutes. I've really appreciated this. I feel like, we have some diverse viewpoints represented here. I did try to get a couple others as well to be here to give us their viewpoint, but this was pulled together a little bit last minute. And I want to thank all of you for being here. I'd like to, ask all of you, what are some biblical, I've heard already Matthew 25, but give me some Bible, principles, some biblical admonitions that I guess you feel are guiding you in this moment. What biblical admonition is kind of giving you some guidance at this moment in time? Because, we have so many things going on in our world, and, whether you see a threat from the political left or the political right when it comes to religious liberty, or you see these issues of immigration as being somehow becoming a humanitarian and spiritual issue. We have a lot of things going on. What guides you in this particular area? And, I'm thinking about Matthew 25. Daniel, you brought this up. And to me, there's some guidance here that Jesus says, I was a stranger, which is really, the word is foreigner, right? And you invited me in. So on an individual level, I think at least on an individual level, God is calling us to do that. I was in prison. I was detained. I was incarcerated, and you visited me, right? So Jesus calls us to love and to minister to the needs of those around us who are going through who are in these very situations that we've been discussing today. I think at a very minimum, I see that in Scripture. What do you guys see? What are some guiding principles from the Bible that you guys see?
Well, there's also the strangers in the land that that God told the children of Israel on because you were strangers as well, and we've all been strangers, at some point. Like, I come from an immigrant family. I come from Canada. I'm an immigrant to the U.S., and then my families were immigrants to Canada. We've all been strangers at some point, and so to have empathy, a sense of justice, fairness, I think that should drive us. It may not be this, just to kind of address, I did use an extreme example about slavery, and it's not the same. You're right, Mark. But we can look back in history. There's different times where the internment of Japanese, desegregation. Where do we stand on these issues? People were and so the sense of justice and fairness, I think, individually should compel us, and not just political black and white,
Yeah. Should the church have spoken up against the internment of Japanese Americans, right? A hypothetical question. I'll throw it out there. I don't know that we need to answer it. Should the church have spoken up during Jim Crow, and some churches did. some churches took a stand on these issues, not maybe as black and white as slavery. Interesting. Mark, what are some principles spiritually that you feel like are, good guidance for us in a situation like this?
Yeah, as I've really become, I don't know if tolerant is the right word in my old age, but
You're not that old, Mark. Come on, man.
yeah, no, grace and mercy have really forgiveness, grace, mercy, forgiveness, accountability have been things that I've been dealing with, on a regular basis, actually. And I mean, I just had a situation where someone did something that was pretty egregious, and I was encouraged to really drop the hammer on them. And my response was, I'm going to have a discussion with them, and if they take responsibility for what they did, as bad as it was, I'm going to forgive them and give them another chance. We may have some trust issues going forward for a while, but I believe in redemption, right? And I look at how God forgives us of basically everything that we do, right? And I've done some really stupid things in my life, and God has grace and mercy on me. And what does that say about how I need to treat other people? So as strongly as I feel about this whole issue because of my origin story, I do believe in grace. Just like when I brought up not to beat a dead horse, but the South Korean soldier again. I wish I could have been in the room with people who were making a decision on whether to escalate, his deportation, because that's a situation I think where I probably would have had some sort of mercy and figured out, okay, what's another way to deal with this? You still put them on the path towards citizenship, but does it have to involve something as drastic as what he has done, self deportation? So for me, I really do want to try and force myself actually to have more compassion, even though I have, I gave you the hypothetical about parents being separated from their kids here in the U.S. I mean, even that's not a black and white issue necessarily when you're dealing with immigrants, and people who have been here for a very long time, for example, right? So I do want to be guided by the concept of grace and mercy.
I like that. I think that is so interesting, Mark, that you say that too, because I look at, several of us here are lawyers and we deal with the law. The law is unforgiving, right? There are penalties that the law enacts. It's not there's not grace, generally speaking, when it comes to law. Yeah, we do have pardons. We have some of those things, but those are few and far between and generally not part of our, judicial process in and of itself. And then we think about God, right? And I feel like this is where we as Christians can come into the picture and bring a different third way, if you will, to this conversation, right? Because you have the kingdoms of this world and how they operate, and we kind of have extremes oftentimes, but we come along as children of God and we say, Jesus shows us the way. I love that. I love that. And I wish, there's been a big push recently to put 10 commandments up on the walls of schools, but I wish we'd start, if we're going to do that, let's start with the Beatitudes. I mean, it's like, let's start with the mercy first before we get to the law. I don't know. I just feel like that's huge. I appreciate that. Daniel, I'm going to let you kind of give us your perspective. And then I got one more thing to share before we wrap this up.
No doubt. No, I did want to just, before I answer your question, I think it's important also to maybe go back a little bit to that whole piece about enforcement and then the criminal aspect. There's a report on the ICE website right? They have a detention report, fiscal year 2025. And it's interesting to see, right, since January 2025, there's been a 59% increase in detaining folks with criminal records, undocumented folks with criminal records. Since that same period of time, there's been a 12,000 increase in detaining folks with no criminal records. So 7% high threat, undocumented criminal immigrants detained, but 80% no threat, non-criminal undocumented immigrants have also been detained. So you're talking about due process, you're talking about civil liberties, you're talking about those things, and then also balancing that out with what is our prophetic calling? What should we be doing regarding these issues, regardless of our politics, right? And I remember being in another city council meeting with a community member saying, today it's their due process, tomorrow is your Second Amendment, you know? And people sometimes don't consider, right, the implications of these types of behaviors. We forget the Chinese Exclusion Act. We forget Operation Wetback. We forget all these exclusionary and discriminatory practices within our own immigration justice system. Mm-hmm. And many times we assume that it's a system that, you know, is working properly. When we see that these things are happening, I think we can come to a pretty good conclusion that it's not black and white, right? And so I'm going to share something that I shared with the city council when you're asking like my perspective. I'm going to share it because I think it'll be better if I read it. This is what I said. I said, as a Christian, I recall the prophets who stood for justice because they knew they were first citizens of the kingdom of God. Prophet Daniel told King Nebuchadnezzar that God operates with different values than earthly empires. In Matthew 25, Jesus reminds us that God's standard of judgment is not whether you are Republican, Democrat, white, brown, rich, poor, male, female, citizen, or not. Judgment is based on what you did or not do for the least of these, defined as the outcast and marginalized in society. Biblical justice at the basic level deals with pursuing what is just and right for all members of society, especially the powerless and marginalized. Leviticus 25 states that his subjects are to love and help foreigners as they would their families. Deuteronomy 24 instructs believers to show justice to foreigners and that God curses those who withhold justice from them. Jeremiah 7 also equates oppressing foreigners with false religiosity, idolatry, and murder. So I think that when we're looking at those biblical verses and biblical principles, a lot of which, Steve, to give you credit, come from your awesome book on biblical justice, I think it's very important for us to be able to keep that in mind when we're thinking about justice, when we're thinking about grace, when we're thinking about mercy, for us to understand that our duty first and foremost is to God. And when we are looking at our own government or our own immigration systems, to not assume that they are just simply because they're from the United States of America, that we have enough love to be able to protect, but also to correct systems that are not operating how they should and that are marginalizing and criminalizing people who ought not to be.
Thank you, Daniel. Any response to that before we kind of wrap it up here? I want to just say thank you to all of you. And I think what I can gather from our conversation is that all of us here, even if we might have different opinions on exactly how immigration and immigration enforcement ought to look, we all agree that immigrants are our fellow human beings, that we should care because all human beings should be treated with justice, with compassion, with love. And I think Daniel, as you brought up Deuteronomy, it reminds me that as the Israelites were foreigners, right, immigrating from Egypt into the promised land, so we as Christians ought to view ourselves as foreigners in this world. I think oftentimes we don't, and that gets us into trouble. Because if we recognize that we are just passing through, as the old song says, right? And we realize that our citizen, as Paul says in Philippians, is first and foremost in heaven. And Peter talks about us being strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Then I think it would give us a sense of compassion for those around us. And it would help us detach a little bit, I think, from our sometimes how we get so invested in our earthly country that we are a part of, as great as it might be, right? And we can look through spiritual eyes. And so I think, just to wrap it up here, Revelation chapter 14, I mean, those of us in this circle here are Seventh-day Adventists. So you've been hanging around the Adventists for a while. You got to know Revelation 14, right? But the part I want to talk about here is Revelation 14, verse 6 and 7. Look what it says. Then I saw another angel flying in midair. And this is, by the way, right before Jesus comes back, and he had the eternal gospel. That's the grace that you're talking about, Mark, to proclaim to those who live on the earth. Here it is, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. And I really think as people of God, that's got to be first and foremost in our mind, that, as the governments of the world do their thing, let us step back and say, let us be like Jesus to everybody, right? That's our first mission. And then secondly, how can we help right now, right? And I think you guys have all talked about some different ways. And I appreciate, I think, Mark, you were the one that said, on a personal level, get out and represent people if you can, right, in court. I mean, if you're a lawyer, right? And maybe we can just wrap it up with that. Any closing thoughts on just some practical, what can people do if they want to help right now? Let's do that, because I'd like to end on a practical note. Who wants to start?
I'll start. I think, we have a lot of great guidance through the Adventist Community Services Manual when it talks about, issues or even systemic issues and how the church ought to operate and how it should collaborate with, let's say, other community-based organizations that, although they might not agree on everything, but they can agree on the dignity of people.
Yeah.
So I think being less insular and being more open to letting our community service directors or even our PARL leaders to be able to create a space in our churches to be able to bring in our youth and others who care about this type of work, who want to grow in this type of work and be involved and not close our doors. I think it's very important to be able to be less insular and be more open. I think that's one way. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anybody else? Practical ways that people can help in this area if they feel so moved.
Well, I think it's important that people keep an open mind and try to get the facts. There's a lot of people that just have patently false information. And I think it's important that we open our minds in both directions. I mean, left or right, but to really, whether you're pro or against, to really understand what the facts are. And because if you're being filled with misinformation, and you're only hearing one side, then you're going to start developing biases and an understanding and a picture that's going to affect the way you can act as a Christian. Because we all, I believe that everyone that we're talking about in an organized church, they mean well. But if you're dealing with misinformation and falsehood, you're gonna develop a perception that is guided by biblical principles, but you're not dealing with reality. And so I would urge people to really just try to get the facts, and then help, and then as we talked about, be guided. Mark, what you said, grace and mercy. At the end of the day, you can't go wrong with being grace, giving grace. And so wherever you can. And Mark, you can always help pro bono. There's an immigrant out there that could use your help as a lawyer. So I can connect you.
Well, just on that note, I already have my retirement plan in place. Won't necessarily involve immigrants, but I just read the book framed by John Grisham and another guy who works for an Innocence Project. And it was 20 true stories of people who have been wrongfully convicted of crimes who were actually innocent. So in my retirement years, I'm going to volunteer for an Innocence Project to try and help people who are actually innocent of crimes. But I want to just comment on Steve's point and question. So social media has a huge audience. I would say use it, but brace yourself for arrows when you do that, because there's a lot of people are keyboard warriors, and they can be really say some very mean things to you. So I've pulled back on that myself, because it's just not really worth it for me, because it's so toxic on some levels. But that is a way to reach a lot of people. And I think if you're going to do that, or even if it's not social media, if it's any other means, I read a quote by the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who I actually got to meet, a very nice lady. She said, I'm paraphrasing here, make your point as passionately as possible, but do it in a way that will get others to agree with you and follow you. Mm. So that's the way I would approach it.
Love it. Hey, thank you guys so much for being here today. And we are 3 minutes away from our goal of ending at 6 p.m. I like it. So let's just have a prayer. Can we do that? I know we prayed together offline before, but let's just do it together with those who might be watching today. And I'll have a prayer to close here. Father God, we just thank you that you are above all and in control. And so I want to lift up our brothers and sisters in the church who are experiencing fear in their lives right now because they might feel like they're being targeted. Those who are both documented and undocumented, maybe some people who've even made some mistakes and like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done this, whatever. God, we pray for your grace and mercy. And we also pray that we as human beings would show that same grace and mercy to each other. I pray for your spirit to encourage them right now. Be with your church, God. Give us as your people wisdom to know how to live like Jesus in this world, to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God, to be the hands and feet of Jesus to the least of these. Lord, we want that. And I pray that you would just guide us. I know you're going to. I thank you for Mark, for Danny, and for Daniel. I pray for your blessing on them as well. And everyone here who has joined us this afternoon and who may watch in the future. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, guys. Happy Sabbath. Have a good evening. And I appreciate you guys spending your time here talking about this today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.